My name is Yingyi Ma. I'm a professor of sociology from Syracuse University. It's my great honor to moderate this distinguished panel. I'm also a public intellectual fellow of the National Committee of U.S.-China Relations. So thanks for National Committee for organizing us here. So I'd like to introduce our distinguished panel here. Sitting next to me is Terry Lautz. Terry is one of the co-editors of this book. Terry and I also has this long relationship at Syracuse University, and he used to be a visiting scholar at Maxwell School, where I teach, and also the director for several years of East Asia program there. So I'm very honored to be invited by Terry to be one of the early endorsers of this book. So that's Terry Lautz. Next is Deborah Davis, my fellow sociologist, who is also the one of the co-editors of this volume. Deborah is a professor of sociology emeritus at Yale University, also has been a visiting scholar for many years at Schwarzman College until this year. And Deborah Davis has been a co-editor of this book. Also, it's going to talk about a chapter on former Fudan University Chancellor Xie Xide. It's a contributing chapter. I learned so much from that chapter as well. Thank you, Deborah. Next is Elizabeth Knup. Elizabeth is currently just joining Center for China Analysis at Yale at Asia Society. And Elizabeth has been the former director of China program at Ford Foundation for 10 years, from 2013 to 2023. And Elizabeth also is contributing a chapter on Zhang Ye, who is a civil society leader. And honestly, before reading the book, I learned so much about civil society and Zhang Ye. I've not really know this person. So this is Elizabeth. And next is Sheila Melvin, whom I just met. And Sheila is a specialist in arts in China and music, right? She had wrote several books. She's the author of the Little Red Book of China business. And because Sheila, you wrote business case studies for Stanford University Graduate School of Business. And in addition to that, you also wrote Beethoven in China, how the great composer became an icon in the People's Republic. Thank you, Sheila, for joining our panel. All right, so without further ado, I'd like to first introduce Terry to give us an overview of the book.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to see you. It's wonderful to be with you. Wonderful to be with all of you. And this book started with an earlier book, Americans in China. And when I was giving a talk about this, my co-editor for the new book that we're talking about today, Deborah Davis, said, what about looking at the flip side, the mirror image? What about Chinese who came to the United States? So the first book, Americans in China, is Americans who had experiences in communist China over a period of time, different professions. And the second book is similar, also focused on the PRC, but it's different in that these are profiles of Chinese citizens who came to the United States and then went back to China. And so we asked our authors, three of whom are with us today, why did they come to the United States in the first place? What was their interest? What were their backgrounds? What were their experiences in the United States? Why did they go back to China? And most importantly, what difference did it make when they went back? What did they do with what they learned? How did it affect their lives, their professions, and even U.S.-China relations? So that's what the book is all about. These are not tourists. These are not immigrants. They are a different kind of group. But Debbie and I divided this book into 3 generations, and you'll hear from one profile of each of these 3 generations. First generation are people who were exposed to the United States or American culture before the Chinese communist victory of 1949. and they were punished because of this. But then when they were able to, they played a critical role in helping to reestablish relations after 1940, after Nixon came to China in 1972. Second generation are people who survived the Cultural Revolution and came to the United States to help rebuild China after the disaster of that event, that period. And the third generation are a younger group who came because they saw opportunities both in the United States and in China. We had three objectives in writing this book. One was to humanize the relationship and to get beyond what you typically read in the headlines and tell a more positive story. Secondly, we wanted to tell this story from Chinese perspectives. Our authors are all Americans, but they put themselves in the shoes of the Chinese. And then thirdly, we wanted to challenge the standard narrative about the failure of engagement with China, the idea that engagement somehow was a terrible mistake. So we want to enlarge that conversation and say that engagement is more than just geopolitical and geostrategic relations. It really covers so many issues, and you'll hear about some of those issues from my colleagues.
This first group are a group of people, all of whom had very advanced education before 1949. They therefore were exposed actually to people who had been trained in the U.S., were in institutions that were funded by various kinds of American companies. They had a very special life, but they were very much oriented towards education and education overseas. This first chapter, Xie, she's known as, in China, well, first I want to say something. So I wrote the chapter together with Dick Madsen. He's another sociologist. He's UCSD. He's been provost at UCSD. He's also been the head of the UC China program for many, many years. So he actually met Xie in person. My way of writing about the chapter with Dick was to use videos, to use memoirs, and to use interviews with people who knew Xie. And with that composite, we tried to tell the story of this extraordinary woman. This is a picture of her in Tennessee in her later years. She's known in China as the mother of the semiconductor. The details are in the book. So she has a PhD from MIT in 1951 and postdocs in her life as a physicist and a mathematician. She's also known, I think among the Americans, as the founder of the Fudan American Center. And this she did while she was president of Fudan University, where she was the first female president of Fudan. But what we want to stress in the chapter is a theme that runs through her life and some of the others, what we are calling the cosmopolitan patriot, a term which is now being picked up again and used. And what we're flagging there is the cosmopolitan life in which Xie and her family lived in the 1920s and 1930s. They lived in large houses with running water, with cars. They went to schools that had hockey fields and theater presentations. It was in Changsha, the Gaoli school that the young people and Terry have been affiliated to, would be an example of that. But there were examples throughout metropolitan China of these extraordinary schools in which people grew up expecting not only boys, girls as well as boys, to finish high school, but to go on to college and then go on to graduate school. So in the case of Xie, her grandfather and her father both had PhDs in the United States, and they both taught at Yingyi. So in this early, I wanted to have a picture of her. Everyone loves this picture. It's in the book. It was her graduation picture in 1938 in Changsha. But this childhood was extraordinarily turbulent. It's something that the others in this group share, and it comes up in different ways than the others. But that's one of the themes we're also interested in. So focus on those very early years, the family life, and what was going on. What kind of experience did these ultimately extremely famous professionals have in their early years? Partly as a way to help American readers identify with someone who they might think was quite different. So this is Sheila, graduating from high school. She had a really difficult tragic childhood. Her mother died in 1924 while her father was overseas. Then she's reunited with her in Beijing, and comes the war, the bombing. They start the journey south, and they go to various places, Wuhan, Guizhou, Changsha, and then they spend the rest of the war up in the mountains. But during that time, she's also diagnosed possibly TB, nobody knows, but she's in a body cast for 2 years and actually bedridden. She continues to study. On the exams, she passes the exams, and she goes to university. She's an extraordinary person. And this is another part of her extraordinary life. This is her husband, who's also a scientist trained by Needham in the UK. They knew each other as children on the Yingyi campus, and then they later become pen pals. And before he leaves the UK, he comes down to where they are in Shannon, and they become engaged. And their plan is they will both finish their PhDs, he in England, she in the US, and then they will go back and build a new China. Then comes the Korean War, and the U.S. puts an embargo on American educated Chinese scientists, and what she's going to do. Ever resourceful, she finds a way, partly through intermediaries, to convince U.S. consular officials that she's just going to get married and she'll return. Yes, she makes it to the UK. Needham arranges for them to be married, and they then get on a ship and return to China in time for National Day, their first National Day. And at that point, it looks like life is really going to be smoother, and the investment they've made in China's future is going to pay off for the country, not just themselves. 56 to 58 is part of the complexity. She's chosen to work with one of the famous physicists at Beida, to work with the Russian experts on the development of the semiconductor, and that's what she does for 2 years. She leaves her child behind, and off she goes to Beijing for 2 years, where they are successful. They write the textbook, which to this day is still used. It's an extraordinary treatment. She comes back. The anti-rightist movement doesn't really undermine her very much. It puts her on caution, but it doesn't destroy her career or the upward movement. She's already joined the party in 56. In 1960, she leads the first trip overseas. It really looks like life will change. 62, at age 40, she becomes a full professor at Fudan, and in 1966, she takes the first delegation to Europe. And then we know things change again, much for the worse. She definitely is attacked. Her husband is sent off to Seven Cotter School. She is demeaned and sent into a janitorial job.
Deborah, you have 1 minute left.
1 minute left. We're almost there. This is the last slide. So she makes a return. And it starts in 1961. We write it some detail about her connection to C.N. Yang, who was in Terry's first book. Everyone in this room knows C.N. Yang. There's an interesting story about how first she is helped invisibly, and it were helped by him, and later starts a lifelong partnership with diaspora scientists, which works to the benefit of the scientists in the U.S., the individuals, and the people who return to China. So this picture, which we're ending with, is when she welcomes President Reagan in 1984 to Fudan. And she's chosen because she's the president of Fudan. Shanghai is chosen over Beijing because Shanghai will have business opportunities. And just by the way, his wife is also a graduate of Smith College, which is where she got her master's. So she seemed the perfect fit. And I would say that for the next 16 years, we see again and again how, quote, she seems a perfect fit. But what I want to emphasize, Dick and I, one is the cosmopolitan patriot. This person is a devoted patriot who puts the country and the party before her family, before her own concerns, over and over and over again. So this is what I would say is one of the main messages that we want to get across in this chapter.
When I was reading about C.C. I know C.C. but this chapter still gave me tons of information, and it's deeply moving and inspiring, especially at the time that probably some of you are just like me, very anxious and nervous about and disillusioned, disappointed with the escalating bilateral tensions. Read this chapter, you will feel inspired that history is long. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Excellent, thank you so much. I think if you read the whole book, you'll be inspired. The arc of the book is really tells a very inspiring story. So I've known Janya personally for many decades, and so this chapter is written primarily based on my personal interviews with her over a period of time. And when I first came to her with this idea for the book, and what we were trying to achieve, she said, well, my story is a small story in a bigger story. And what she meant by that was that her own personal story took place during a period of time when China was emerging from the Cultural Revolution, embarking on opening and reform, was transforming its own society, and emerging into a global power. So that's the big story she was talking about. I think as I talk to her more, I also think that she reflects other trends that were happening at the same time. So with economic reform and development, individualism emerges out of collectivism. Individuals are individual economic actors and social actors, and she is an example of that kind of transformation. And, you know, one foot in the collective kind of tradition, but moving into a more individualistic kind of tradition. She also is coming of age as a woman in a period of time where questions of women's rights, women's agency, the women's movement is also emerging in China. So she's not alone in this, but her story unfolds as part of that story. And finally, because of the topic of the chapter is civil society leader, she's also right in China at a time when independent civil society starts to emerge, when the ideas are coming from the West. She is a bridge between the West and China on these ideas, and plays a very important personal role in sort of the emerging civil society in China. So I think her small story is really embedded in some very big stories, and so I think even though most of you may not have heard of her, I think she really is an important person to pay attention to in this story. So here's the classic picture of her with her family. She was born in 1954 in Harbin. She was the third of four daughters. She was self-described as a tomboy. She said her father raised her as a boy because they didn't really have any boys in their family. And she attributes a lot of her own kind of resilience and self-confidence to that particular upbringing. I'm going to try not to I don't probably already have time, so I'm going to try to skip a bit of the chronology, but she is, in 1969, is sent down to Inner Mongolia and spends 3 years there as a young teenager. You know, she goes with enthusiasm. She tells how when she goes to the train station, the patriotic songs are playing, she's doing the right thing for the country, but then she gets there and it's hard labor and it's lonely and she's far from her family and she begins to feel kind of stranded there and tries to figure out how to get home. And so her enthusiasm kind of shifts into something else. She finally comes back to Beijing. Her father, who was the president of Beijing Second Foreign Languages School, right? He gets rehabilitated. She goes into the university, studies English. She comes out and she joins the China International Travel Service, where she meets the first group of Americans she's ever met. So she's thinking of Americans as, she calls them helmet-wearing, boot-wearing, soldiers carrying guns, has a very negative view from the media in China. But then she meets Doug Murray and Harry Harding, who are the young, handsome scholar escorts of the Stanford board delegation to China. And they all speak Chinese, and she's suddenly just is like, oh my gosh, Americans are really quite different than what I expected. So from there, she joins the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, and the Ford Foundation is entering China in the late 1980s. They support her to go to Smith College. It's a transformational year for her. She leaves behind a young child. She goes to Smith. She has this experience of experiencing the United States, the U.S. women's movement, female education, to really get some ideas about what she calls the other, how to live this life. She's been trying to figure out what it is, and she starts to get a glimpse of what it is. She comes back, she plays a very important role at the Ford Foundation, particularly post Tiananmen, where she becomes the person that many Americans talk to try to figure out who can we talk to in China, what work can we do in China, where is the pathway forward between the United States and China at a time when things were really quite challenging. And she plays the same role for the Ford Foundation because Peter Geithner actually didn't speak, the head of the Ford Foundation didn't speak Chinese, and she needed to help interpret the American ideas into the Chinese system so that the grantees of the Ford Foundation also understood what Ford was seeking to do. And then, I'm sure I'm close to my minutes, but she continues beyond the Ford Foundation. She has a leadership role in the Asia Foundation. She runs the CSR department at Microsoft in the corporate sector. She then goes on to run an American NGO called the Institute for Sustainable Communities. So the interesting thing to note, one of many interesting things, is once she kind of left CAS and went to the Ford Foundation, her entire career was spent working in American institutions. She never went back into the Chinese system. She stayed in the foreign system. She also never really lived for a long time in the US. She was there for a year when she was at Smith. She went back in the early 90s for a year at Harvard. But she really never lived long-term, whereas I think the next cohort of chapters will be people who lived longer in the U.S. So her kind of special power was to be able to see what was available outside of China, ideas, resources, see what China needed in this moment of transformation, and kind of map the two together in a way that wasn't simply cutting and pasting American and Western ideas onto China, but was really trying to advance Chinese society with the assistance of these ideas. And I think this is an important theme in the book as well, which is this, we want to kind of go away from the idea that the US had all the answers and we just sort of copied them and put them into China and bingo, everything was great. It was more this iterative process of ideas and this classic idea in Chinese of the Qi-Yong dichotomy, the essence of Chineseness and the practicalness of what you can learn from outside China, and this has been something going on in China for centuries and is also continuing to be played out now. So I'm going to stop there and read the book.
I have to say, I have not really known about Zhang Ye's story before reading that chapter. And I find the chapter so thoughtful and informative that I feel Zhang Ye is not just her own stories. It's definitely a bigger history, but also particularly about the history of emergence and booming of civil society. And now we can see there's all, the other direction, right? So now let's come, last but not the least, Sheila, about musician, Peng Peng. And Terry, you want to say something?
If I could just add a footnote, 7 of the 12 chapters in this book are about women. That was not by design. It just happened that way. These were the most interesting and the most dramatic stories that Debbie and I found. So we think that's pretty neat.
And I have 2 fingers on that. As a sociologist, I think that is really quite telling. That study abroad and life and education in the United States is definitely having a gendered impact, profound transformative impact on women, and that's probably not accidental.
I don't think so.
Sheila.
Great. Thank you so much. I also want to say a quick thank you to Terry and Debbie for doing this project, because it took a lot of. So I am talking about Peng Peng Gong, who I think is probably the youngest person in the book. And I should add, my chapter is co-authored with my husband, Jinun Tsai. This is Peng Peng when he's a child. And the most important point about Peng Peng, I'm going to tell you right from the outset, I think is that studying and growing up in America allowed him to become the person he thinks he was meant to be. But the best place for him to be that person was back in China. So that's the interesting thing. Peng Peng was born in Nanjing in 1992. His dad played piano, but his career was frustrated by the Cultural Revolution, so he put all his hopes and dreams on his son. Unfortunately, his son was born with big hands, which is good for playing the piano. He had perfect pitch, and he had an endless passion for music. So he sat and listened to the piano from when he was 2 months old, according to his family. By the time he was 5, he could play by ear anything he heard. He could play the jingles on the television. He could play Chopin etudes. He could play Wagner overtures forwards, and according to his first teacher, backwards. He's a prodigy. Through great effort and great luck, he got to the United States and into the Juilliard pre-college program. You see him in the picture when he was just 9 years old. He was there with a very renowned teacher at Juilliard, Leda Kuplinsky, who accepted him as her student. She was struck by his emotional sensitivity and sort of the depth of his feeling as a 9-year-old. He loved living in New York. He called it a dreamscape. He took advantage of, quote, everything crazy and wonderful about New York City for an artist. He loved the museums, the concerts, the park. He was amazed by open stack libraries. He kept mentioning that over and over. He loved going to the libraries and be able to look at any book he wanted to. His teacher came to see him as someone who can make you believe in reincarnation, because she said he played with the soul of a 70-year-old poet when he was a child. His career took off. He played at Juilliard's 100th anniversary celebration with Itzhak Perlman and Renee Fleming and Emmanuel Axe. He performed on NPR's From the Top. He got orchestra gigs. He started making money. He supported his family. His parents were thrilled because they had really sacrificed a lot to bring him here. And outwardly, everything seemed really great. But inwardly, Peng Peng was really struggling because his favorite book was Catcher in the Rye, and he came to identify with Holden Caulfield very strongly. He became sort of rebellious internally, but he didn't know what to do about it. He said he'd been raised with the Eastern requirement of loyalty and selflessness toward family and country, but at school he learned the Western glorification of individual personality, and he felt that these things were both directly at war in his head, and he just didn't know how to cope with them. He began to have what he called dangerous ideas, and his most dangerous idea was that he didn't want to be a pianist, he wanted to be a composer. So this would be very bad news for his parents because he was well on his way to being the next Yu Zhaowang or Lang Lang. He was really, really very, very talented and successful. And even worse, the language in which he wanted to compose was not new music. He liked old music. He liked the late Romantic period. He loves Mahler. He loves Beethoven. He likes music that people like listening to, basically. So he knew he would never find a place in the American Academy. He knew that they're never going to accept me here because I like to write old melodic romantic music. And he knew American critics would say he was derivative. But he did it anyway. He called up his manager one day, quit all his gigs, told his dad he was quitting, had the biggest fight of his life, survived it, went to Juilliard, said, I don't want to be a pianist, I want to be a composer. Juilliard said, okay, as long as you stay in music, we will support you. And they let him switch over to composition, and we're very supportive of him. He did study composition, graduated, but then he didn't know what he was going to do. And then suddenly, out of the blue, he gets an offer from the Shanghai Philharmonic, offering him a full-time job as resident composer. He's 22. So he says, he's like, I've been in America since I was 9, I've made this life here, but this was a job he couldn't refuse. So he went back to Shanghai, he became resident composer, and he's very happy and successful there. Everything he writes gets performed. He is certain that if he had not come to America, he never would have become a composer. He says, no way, because he would have been in China and he would have been taking tests and participating in competitions. And that's all he would have done, and he would have stayed on that track. He said, it's prizes in China. The opportunity to study here and the resources provided by Juilliard let him understand how to live as a world citizen, in other words, for a cosmopolitan, and had given him a more objective view of just about everything. He said it taught him to think smartly, and at the same time to develop his own inward nationalism and patriotism, to be that sort of cosmopolitan patriot. So it gave him the opportunity to become the composer he was born to be, and the best place to be that composer is in China, where audiences welcome his work, the government supports the arts, you can actually make a living as a full-time composer, which is unheard of in this country. So he came to understand that there were different kinds of freedom, is how he puts it. There's one kind of freedom in America, but there's other kinds of freedom in China. And he calls himself a translator in both directions. He plans to spend his life working to create music that comes from China, but speaks to the world. And he says there's so many great things from both the U.S. and China that can be combined and become a new, truly international force. He says, our common ground is friendship, family, morality, what you wish for the people you love. And these are the things that keep us going and that make music. And his end goal is to write a piece that can unite the cultures of the United States and China. there he is performing, and there he is conducting. Yeah, he's really amazing. And he's got lots of pieces on YouTube, including he wrote a viola concerto, Catcher in the Rye, which is his most performed piece in China. It's very popular in China too. So, okay.
Thank you, Sheila. I have to say, when I read the chapter on Peng Peng, his story was only possible, as he said, in the United States because the education system here allowed him to switch from a pianist to a composer, and that's not going to be possible if he only stays in China. But he found, this new versions of freedom in China because the government support, the full-time composing music. And if you're reading the chapter on how the family received the news of switching and how the NYU, the Juilliard School received the news of switching, that's a remarkable moment of how U.S. and China is really value, self-pursuit and individualism and stuff. Well, please read the book. I'm really a big fan of the book. It's really 12 mini biographies that is shaping history of China. Thank you. Thank you all.